Would you like to move now? Well, we're already kind of set up here. All right, let's get started. So, by way of introduction, my name is Josh Kaplan. I am the newly minted co-chair, along with the longtime co-chair, Mark Abraham, of the newly reimagined and renamed Jewish Community Forum of Raritan Valley. For those of you who may have heard of the Orthodox Forum of Highland Park, Edison, we've kind of changed a little bit, and to kind of express, number one, that we cover the entire area, including East Brunswick and other, up and coming communities. And also that there may be topics that aren't necessarily, given by Orthodox speakers, but have something, to do with what we're interested in. Anyway, I want to welcome you to this evening's program. The Jewish Community Forum is a grassroots organization that brings topics of interest to the local community in Middlesex County, including, as I said, Edison, Highland Park, and East Brunswick. And if you're interested in being part of the planning process, which is an ongoing process, please reach out to me or Mark. We also want to say that we rely on donations for financial support. We don't have a huge budget, but we do would like to bring in top quality speakers. And for information about donating, it's on the flyers, or you can go to the orthodoxjewishforum.org. Is that still the okay? Or you can contact Mark or myself at any time. We'd like to thank Dr. Barry and Marshall Levinson, who were instrumental in bringing Rabbi Dr. Reichman to our community for Shabbos. I actually had the privilege of going this morning to hear him speak, and we had quite a source sheet, which was pretty fascinating. So you're in for a treat. I can share this with anybody. It was really fascinating, I must say. And this is in honor of the 3rd anniversary of their 40th wedding anniversary. That's what the script says. We'd also like to thank Congregation Our Torah for giving us the space to meet here this evening. And with that, before we begin the program, I just wanted to ask you to say the date for the second program, which is going to be Sunday, December 8th at 10 a.m. It'll be a virtual event because Rabbi Benjamin Zimmerman is based in Israel, I believe. And he'll be speaking about a very relevant topic, halakhic challenges and questions from the current war. So that should be interesting and kind of important. So now I'd like to call on Dr. Barry Levinson, a longtime supporter and member of our program committee, who will introduce our speaker.
So I guess being a sponsor gets you the privilege or pain of introducing the speaker. Actually, it's a privilege. Rabbi Dr. Edward Reichman is a whole litany of things, which I think you can see in the brochure. But he is a professor of emergency medicine at Albert Einstein, where I think you also got your medical degree, right? And he's an attending physician in the emergency department at Montefiore. He also teaches at YU, where he is a named chair, mostly about Jewish medical ethics in both those places. He has a particular interest in Jewish medical history and Jewish law. And his latest book is called The Anatomy of Jewish Law, a fresh dissection of the relationship between medicine, medical history, and rabbinic literature. And if for no other reason, you should read it for the title. It's on my reading list. There's no further ado.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and it's supposed to be here. Happy anniversary, happy anniversary, happy anniversary. The topic for our discussion tonight is the utilization of modern media as a means of extracting some fascinating and very complex issues related to Judaism and medicine. And the series that we have chosen for this evening is a series called Shtisel. How many of you have actually seen Shtisel? We have a fair amount. You needn't have seen Shtisel. You needn't have heard of Shtisel. But it is a fascinating series. How many of you have seen season 3? Did you see through season 3?
That was Ruchami?
That was Ruchami and Chanina. So there may be a spoiler alert here. So sorry about that. Sorry about that, guys. So what we're going to do is you all have your handouts. I think the last person that walked in needs a handout. I'm going to read a synopsis of the story. I'm going to ask you please to pay attention to the story and then share your thoughts about the story, about what topics from a halachic perspective or non-halachic perspective that we would address in this fascinating case of this couple, Ruchami and Chanina. So please take your handouts as I read through and follow along, and I will begin. Ruchami and her husband Chanina are a young Orthodox Jewish couple living in Israel. In their first year of marriage, Ruchami becomes pregnant, and at 21 weeks of pregnancy, she is hospitalized for shortness of breath. She is diagnosed with pulmonary artery hypertension, a rare disease. The pregnancy is making her condition worse. The doctors tell her she must deliver and possibly abort the baby now, even though the baby's chance of survival at 21 weeks is very small, and if she refuses, she will likely die. Ruchami refuses. Chanina consults with his rabbi. The rabbi's response is clear. The Torah rules that if there is a significant risk to Ruchami's life, she must do as the doctors advise. They deliver the baby, but sadly, the baby does not survive. As another pregnancy could be fatal, after the hospitalization, Ruchami has an IUD, intrauterine device, implanted to prevent further pregnancies. 5 years pass, and Ruchami and Chanina are happily married, but Ruchami desperately longs for a child. After taking counsel from his rabbi, Chanina reluctantly agrees to surrogacy, and they contract with an agency. Ruchami is given special bump pillows of different sizes to fake pregnancy so that the surrogacy can remain completely confidential. You can pause, take a look on the other side of your handout. You can see what these bump pillows look like. However, Chanina reveals his ambivalence about surrogacy, causing Ruchami to renege on the arrangement before the surrogate becomes pregnant. She does not tell Chanina what she has done. She then secretly has her IUD removed and conceives a child. She does not tell Chanina until the pregnancy is well advanced. Chanina fears for Ruchami's life and meets with the doctor without Ruchami to ask advice. The doctor tells him there is a 1 in 1,000 chance Ruchami and the baby will survive, and that she must not rely on a miracle. She must abort as soon as possible. The doctor encourages Chanina to find someone who can influence Ruchami to make the, quote, right decision. Chanina then consults with his rabbi again, but instead of providing a definitive answer, his rabbi says, quote, you are a Torah scholar and believe in God. Immerse yourself in Torah study, and you will find the guidance you seek. Chanina goes to the Beis Medrash, the house of study, to learn before meeting with Ruchami's parents, and believes he finds exactly such a sign from God in the Talmudic passage he is learning. Chanina and Ruchami put their faith and trust in God and decide to keep the pregnancy. Late in the pregnancy, Ruchami has an episode of severe shortness of breath and is rushed to the hospital. Chanina is informed that it is a matter of life and death for both mother and child. He prays outside the operating room for the welfare of his wife and of his child. Any thoughts? Any thoughts about?
What's the conclusion? Did she deliver the baby, or did
So I'll tell you the conclusion at the end. Yes.
In second pregnancy, it says late in the pregnancy, is this also at a time when it would be too premature for the baby to survive outside the womb?
So this would, yeah. I'm sorry.
Repeat the question for Zoom.
Yeah. So the question was, in the second pregnancy, would this be too late for the child to survive outside the womb? So the answer is, when they initially find out, it would be too late for the child would not survive outside the womb.
Too early.
As too early. Yeah, as things progress, the child would be able to survive outside the womb, but it would be too dangerous for her to carry.
so this is an occupational hazard, but there are treatments for PAH.
Excellent. So there are treatments for pulmonary artery hypertension. So would those treatments be sufficient? So, well, they don't have such wonderful physicians available to them. So, and they can't afford the treatment for PAH at this time. But of course, And by the way, we just had a full Shabbos of issues related to medicine and Torah. Keeping current and understanding the currency of these things is an essential ingredient in all these discussions. And we're going to talk about abortion as part of our discussion. And we talked about Tay-Sachs disease. The understanding of where we are today might radically change decisions that were rendered years ago. Wouldn't necessarily change the basic halachic principles, but might change the conclusions that even if these poskim were alive today, would render today, given the current information. So yes, this case might be a little different if PAD was easily treatable, as you mentioned, but for our purposes, it is not. Yes.
Well, it's also a question of birth control. Like,
Excellent.
is it halachically acceptable?
Right. So is any form of birth control halachically acceptable? When would birth control be acceptable? And is this particular form of birth control the appropriate form of birth control? And how does that factor into the halachic decision?
If the mother to be is willing to risk her life, like meaning she's almost willing to die for having a child, is that something she can choose?
So excellent. Does the woman have a right to make that decision to put her life at risk? And that is certainly something we need to consider. How much risk can a woman take? Can she risk her life for the child? Literally risk her life to produce a child? Yes.
So it's interesting, in the first scenario, she's pregnant, experiencing symptoms. There's an immediate threat to the mother. The second time they ask the question of the Rav, appears not to be an immediate threat. So whether to abort or try to deliver early could differ based on whether the mother's experiencing symptoms at that moment or not.
So excellent question. The question is, are the medical circumstances different in pregnancy B versus pregnancy A? In the first pregnancy, she was already symptomatic, and that's when it came to their came to them that she was in fact suffering from this diagnosis of pulmonary artery hypertension. But in the second one, they knew she was pregnant, but she hasn't yet developed any medical symptoms. Does that alter the equation? So it definitely gives us more time to make the decision than in time A, when the decision was truly immediate. But here also, the decision would need to be made within a relatively short period of time.
Two things. The second may be beyond the scope, so you tell me if we get it. The first one is we haven't had, you can infer what Ruchami's psychological state is going into both of these, right? In particular, the second one, which is the one we're analyzing. So does her feeling about what her life would be without a child affect the halachic analysis? That's number one, because there's a mental health issue as well. The second one is there's a principle that we don't rely on, like we don't get signs from God, right? You're not allowed to do that. So here you have the absence of a clear halachic guidance, and then the way it's presented in the show, right, is that all of a sudden he happens to be learning that Gemara, he sees a thing and that tells him what to do. Is that halachically acceptable? Probably not. But
Great. Two excellent points. Point number one is, does her mental health factor into the decision making? And there's no question that mental health, more so today than in past history, there is a sensitivity and a realization that mental health and physical health are very much intertwined, and poskim are much more sensitive to the mental health dimension of halachic decision making, far more so than in the past. With respect to your second question, I guess one way to categorize that would be whether ein somchin ala nes, whether it's permissible for them to rely on what in essence would be a miracle, and to what extent they're permitted to believe in prayer to the exclusion of Western medicine, which, by the way, is clearly related to our discussion, clearly important discussion, and there are religions. Like Christian Scientists, for example, that don't believe in medicine and will, exclusively believe in prayer. There are some categories of our Jewish community that also are not interested in seeking medical care. Fortunately, a very tiny group, but that is clearly not the mainstream. But that definitely is an important part of our discussion as well. Yes.
Couple of questions, I guess, from the stock perspective. In the first case, the rabbi is very definitive in saying what should be done. And in the second case, he said, go off on your own. In the Tzias, or the particulars that they give in that case is it didn't give a definitive percentage of what the odds were. They just said there's a very small chance or whatever it was of survival and probably. In the second case, there was a more definitive, it's the 1/1000 situation, which would be a very much more definitive perspective. And then he goes off and says, go off and study on your own. I assume he's a competent post-state. Why did in one case, you can see that so the situation looked to be very similar. Why in one case is he definitive, the other case is he not definitive in terms of what they should do? They should go up and figure it out themselves.
Makes for much better television. So I think that's the answer. Andy, who's an actor, by the way. I think that's the answer. I think you need to have sort of a literary license to make the story a little more entertaining. But there is an important halachic question there. Is it halachically appropriate for the rabbi to make that kind of statement? I'm not going to paskin for you, which is kind of what you said. Expect divine providence when you go learn in the base medrash that God's going to guide your hand. God's going to tell you what to do, which is really, and I'll get you have another question in a second. Which is really our objective tonight. Our objective tonight is to determine whether the producers of Netflix got their halacha correct or not. That's what we are going to do. There are a number of halachic issues that arise in this, and we will address them, and we will ask the question for every single one: did Netflix get it right? Actually, it's produced in Israel, but I think shown in Netflix. But did the producers of Shtisel get it correct, or did the producers of Shtisel not get it correct? Yes.
Is it a halachic concern that Ruchami is not honest with her husband?
That's a great question. My wife's the psychologist. I'll let her deal with that. I think that's a little beyond my scope. But that's a fascinating question too. Was it permitted for her to deceive her husband and not share her husband? Did you have a second
I
question?
did. It was just the question was it's a follow-on to the first. I assume that at some point in time you're going to get into the discussion of whether or not this was a situation of real dates or not. And the question is why in the first case wouldn't it have been possibly a case of real dates but not in the second case?
Great. So road date we will definitely address the issues of road date. Great. Yeah. So this will be
a little bit tangential, but what's the status of surrogacy in halacha? Do we permit surrogacy? Why is she hiding the pregnancy to try to pretend that she's not using a surrogate? What's the process?
Great. So that's not tangential at all. It's part of our discussion. This is in the Hasidic community, the right-wing community, and there was a little tension about whether surrogacy would be permitted, not be permitted, and you saw the husband was a little reticent, originally agreed, but was and she sensed that. So that is definitely part of our discussion. Is surrogacy permitted, and what are the halachic issues that relate to surrogacy? So let's take a look at some of these issues. There are four major issues that I want to discuss, and we will deal with these issues and see where it takes us. Issue number one on your handout. As you turn the page, Ruchami is 21 weeks pregnant, and the rabbis tell her, I'm not going to reread it, the rabbis tell her that she must abort. In essence, she must abort the child. So the question that we have to discuss is the halachic issues of abortion. What does halacha say about abortion? Now, we are now in the post-reversal of Roe versus Wade world, and we as a Jewish community have sort of been revisiting what the issues are about abortion and the halachic issues about abortion, and for sure about what we should recommend in terms of legislation about abortion and what the Supreme Court says about abortion. I'm not competent to share with you the legal dimensions. That's not my field. I'm here from the medical and the halachic approach to abortion. Abortion is one of the most complex areas of halacha. An area which does not have absolute consensus. So if I were to ask you, and there's some really nuanced areas here, but I want to share with you some of the highlights. If I were to ask you, for example, where in the Torah does it say explicitly what the prohibition of abortion is for a Jew? The answer is nowhere. Nowhere in the Torah does it tell you what the prohibition is for a Jew to perform an abortion. If I were to ask you where in the entire Talmud does it tell you what the exact prohibition is for a Jew to perform an abortion, what is the answer? Nowhere. Nowhere in the entire Talmud does it tell you what the prohibition of abortion is. Now, we know there is a prohibition. How do we even know there is a prohibition? But we know, and I'll share with you some of the psukim in the Torah that there is a prohibition. But exactly the nature of that prohibition is a matter of intense debate for thousands of years. The nature of that prohibition has tremendous impact on when and where abortion would be permitted. So there are two psukim in the Torah that bear on our discussion of abortion. One is, I'll read them in the English, when two men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according to the woman's husband, as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. So it's a little awkward English, but the bottom line is that if a person induces an abortion, there is financial compensation for inducing a spontaneous miscarriage. I'm not going to get into the complexities of the interpretation of this and the sugya in the Gemara about it, but if I were to ask you, what does this tell you about the nature of abortion? It seems to indicate that abortion is not a capital crime because financial compensation is being offered and not capital punishment. There may be a variety of reasons why that is, but just very superficially, very simply, it seems to indicate that a fetus is not a full human life and one would not be guilty of homicide for performing an abortion. On the other hand, we have at the beginning of the Torah, Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech, one who sheds the blood of a man. So I'll actually read the pasuk as it's supposed to be interpreted, and then I'll read it in the way the Torah, the Gemara interprets it. Shofech dam ha'adam, if somebody sheds the blood of a man, ba'adam damo yishafech, through man his blood will be shed. So if someone commits murder, man will take his life. So capital punishment. But the Gemara changes the punctuation a little bit and uses this as the source text for abortion, but not the source text for abortion for a Jew, the source text of abortion for a non-Jew. And that's for a variety of reasons. But in the Gemara says, Shofech adam ha'adam ba'adam. If you shed the blood of a man that is within another man, damo yishafech, your blood will be shed. So what does that mean? What could that possibly mean, a man within a man? So that means a pregnant woman, fetus in utero. That's what ba'adam, adam ba'adam means. So the Gemara is, because this is in before Matan Torah and is not repeated, the Gemara assumes and concludes that this refers to the punishment for abortion for a non-Jew, which, by the way, is not a matter of disagreement and is agreed upon that the prohibition of abortion for a non-Jew is capital punishment. So if a non-Jew performs an abortion from the Jewish law perspective, that is a capital crime for which they can receive the punishment of death. So clearly, abortion is a prohibited act. And then there's further an additional statement in the Gemara that it's impossible to have something which is prohibited for non-Jews, but is permitted for Jews. So if abortion is prohibited for non-Jews, there's no way that someone could now convert into Judaism, and now abortion, which was completely prohibited to them before, is now completely permitted to them now. There's no way that could be. So based on all these principles, and again, I apologize, it's a little bit of a complex sugya, there has been an intense debate, and the debate over the centuries has evolved such that the following are offered in terms of issues of abortion. One, is it even biblical versus rabbinic? D'oraisa versus d'rabbanan. What is the prohibition? Prohibition includes the following: destruction of divine creation, injury or danger to the mother, which is tort law, which is not capital crime. Destruction of reproductive seed. There's a prohibition of ashchasa zera, destroying reproductive seed. Abortion includes, obviously, the destruction of reproductive seed. So maybe it's subsumed under that law. And others argue that it's akin to murder, but not equivalent to murder. And what has evolved are two polar extremes of abortion. I'll share with you two polar extremes with a continuum between the two. So Moshe Feinstein was of the opinion that abortion is akin to homicide. And if abortion is like homicide, it's a very strict prohibition and is only permitted under very limited circumstances. So let me just share with you the basis of Rav Moshe's position, and this is the Rodef. This is you mentioned the Rodef, I think, right? So this is the basis of Rodef, and I'll share with you this Mishnah, which is a source of much discussion. Ha'isha shi makshel, a woman who is having difficulty during childbirth, mechatchin esavlad b'meyeha, and the Mishnah is very graphic. It's her life is at risk. You can dismember the fetus in utero, umotzin oso evarim evarim, remove it limb from limb, mipnei shechayeha kodmin lechayav, because her life takes precedence to the life of the fetus. Yotza rubo, once the fetus exits the birth canal, ein nogin bo. You can no longer touch the fetus. It's now a birth child, a living child. She'ein dochin nefesh mipnei nefesh. Because once the fetus exits the womb, it now becomes a nefesh. And at that point, you can't sacrifice one nefesh for the sake of another nefesh. What Rav Moshe bases his discussion on is the Rambam, and I'm not going to, I apologize, I'm going to do this very briefly, but trust me, there are rabbis who could spend weeks to months literally just on this sugya, just on this Rambam, and the many interpretations of this Rambam. But the Rambam quotes this Mishnah, but adds something very important to the interpretation of this Mishnah, which led Rav Moshe to paskin the way he did. And the Rambam is writing in Hilchos Rotzeach, the laws of murder. And he writes, mitzvos aseh lo lachos al nefesh harodev. The law is you're not supposed to have compassion on someone who is a pursuer, someone who is a rodev. Lefikach, therefore, what does he use as the example of rodev? The rabbis taught, Toru Chachamim, sha'ubra shehi makshaleleid, mentions this exact case. A woman who's having difficulty during childbirth, mutter lach tocha uber b'meyaha, one can dismember the fetus, etc. Why? Mipnei shehu kirodef achareha lecharga. Because the fetus is pursuing her to kill her. And since the fetus is a pursuer, we have the license to take the life of the fetus. But when the fetus head comes out, you can't touch the fetus. Exactly as the Mishnah said, why not? So the Rambam adds, because zehu tiv'o shalom, because this is the nature of the world. Childbirth, this is the nature of the world. So what has bothered people for hundreds of years since the Rambam wrote this is what possessed the Rambam to introduce Rodef into this when the Mishnah doesn't discuss Rodef about this. And what does he believe that would lead him to this seemingly completely incongruous decision? Again, I apologize, we're not going to delve into this, but just so you understand what the complexity is. The Rambam says that in utero, the fetus is a Rodef. But when the fetus is born, he no longer becomes a Rodef. What happened? That in utero, the baby's a Rodef, but when the baby comes out, it's not a Rodef anymore. It's still the same child, and it's still trying to take the life of the mother. So that has plagued people for literally hundreds of years to interpret that Rambam. But based on this Rambam, the Rambam seems to assume, the Rambam seems to assume that the fetus must have a status of human life, must be a nefesh of some shape or form. Because otherwise, why would you have to invoke the whole idea of Rodef to have a license to kill the baby? The simple interpretation, which Rashi has and everybody else has, is that when the fetus is in utero, it's not a life. You can sacrifice something that's not a life to save the mother. Once it comes out, it's a life. That would have been very easy for the Rambam to say. The Rambam didn't say that. So the Rambam assumes that the fetus has a much higher status, a status potentially of real human life, not completely equivalent, because you can't be culpable of homicide and you can't be sentenced to death, but very close. And that's what Moshe Feinstein held. Moshe Feinstein held that the only license to perform an abortion is if the baby is causing the life, putting the life of the mother at risk. It's a very high bar. But others disagree. Since Eliezer disagreed, he said it wasn't akin to abortion. He didn't hold like the Rambam. And since Eliezer hold that abortion is permitted in other cases. So, for example, what's a class example in the Jewish community is abortion permitted for Tay-Sachs disease. So in Tay-Sachs disease, the mother's perfectly healthy. But if the problem is with the fetus, the issue is with the fetus. So if Moshe Feinstein would say, there's no rodef here. There's a healthy mother. There's a child that's going to be born and live years of life. It doesn't meet my criteria. It doesn't meet the threshold. Since Eliezer says abortion is not an issue of capital crime. It's an issue of wounding the mother. We would include psychological issues. We'd include the suffering of the baby. And he would have allowed permission to abort. Now, I ask you, with respect to our case of Shtisel, what would the Rambam say? The Rambam is the most extreme position in the world of abortion. How would the Rambam categorize our case of Ruchami? What do you think?
You would require an abortion. You said lolachos, so that's it.
So if I were to ask you, is the case of Ruchami, does it meet that threshold of a rodef, such that even the Rambam would allow abortion in this case? In the most extreme position? So the answer is an absolute categorical yes. Not only does it meet the criteria of the Rambam, it is the prototypical case of what rodef is. It is literally the fetus pulling circulation away from the mother, drawing the lifeblood away from the mother. There is no question that the Rambam would agree. So in terms of our question, did Shtisel get it right? The answer is, Shtisel got it absolutely right, because every posek would agree. There's not a single posek that wouldn't agree with this, that an abortion would be permitted in this particular scenario.
Permitted or required.
So probably required.
Because Shtisel didn't get it right by the posting.
Right. Probably required, but we'll see when it comes to 3, when it comes to pregnancy 2, there may be room for some kind of wiggle room in terms of whether one is required to do it, especially if the mother refuses to have the abortion. That's where you get into a bit complexity. Okay, the others it'll be a little quicker. So number 2 is the issue of contraception. What does halacha say about contraception? Contraception seems like a relatively straightforward topic. It actually has a lot more complexity than one would imagine. So clearly there is an overarching obligation to be fruitful and multiply, which would mitigate against contraception. But at the same time, there clearly are cases where contraception is permitted. And it's not only the issue of be fruitful and multiply. There's a prohibition against wasting male reproductive seed, which would impact certain forms of contraception. There's a prohibition of sterilization. There's an obligation for the couple to have marital relations. There's medical risks associated with the forms of contraception. Suffice it to say that contraception is not a simple issue. There clearly are cases where it'll be halachically permitted. And each form of contraception has its own medical analysis based on the need for contraception. So in this particular scenario, if she really has a disease for which pregnancy would become fatal, she needs some long-term form of contraception. So an IUD, which is a safe form of contraception and doesn't have some of the other halachic concerns, is actually one of the better forms of contraception from a halachic perspective. And it's a long-term form of contraception. But let me just add, it's an interesting analysis which you may not have considered. It's not even clear to physicians exactly how an IUD works. Feel free to correct me on this. It's not exactly clear how an IUD works. An IUD could work in one of 2 ways. It could prevent conception, which makes it a contraceptive and would implant it, so to speak, in our discussion about contraception, or it could prevent implantation after conception takes place, in which case it does not belong in a discussion about contraception. It belongs in a discussion about abortion. So that is something else to consider. But in answer to our question, is it halachically now? What is one case where all agree where contraception is halachically permitted? When it's a case of pikuach nefesh. So there are many other cases, of course, of contraception for financial purposes, for spacing, for mental health purposes. The whole discussions about contraception. But when it's a case of pikuach nefesh, everybody agrees you're allowed to do contraception for pikuach nefesh. Is this a halachically acceptable form of contraception? The answer is this is most certainly a halachic form of contraception for this use and for this purpose. One could ask the question, maybe they should have done a permanent form of contraception. She really shouldn't be getting pregnant. And that would be a slightly different conversation, because that is a question of sirus, of sterilization. Then one would have to ask, is it better to sterilize the husband, which would be very halachically problematic, or would it better to sterilize the woman, which has less halachic issues? But be that as it may, in answer to our question, did the producers of Shtisel get this right? They're 2 for 2. They got it right for number 2. Number three. Ruchami and Chanina allowed. They have 5 years. They're happily married, but Ruchami wants a child, so they contract a surrogate. Is surrogacy halachically permitted? So surrogacy is a very complex issue in the 20th and 21st century. Surrogacy is one of the ways of treating fertility. The field of fertility has expanded exponentially in the last few decades. One of the most fascinating, complex, and successful areas of medicine in terms of treating infertility. I mentioned that 3 of the 4 imahos suffered from infertility in Sefer Bereshis. If they would have lived today, they would have been mispalel too, but they would have gone to their local OBGYN, who probably would have been able to treat with HaKadosh Baruch Hu's assistance all of the many of the forms of fertility that they suffered from. Even if, according to one shita, that the Sari Menu had the absence of a uterus, so we talked about uterus transplantation as a possibility, a whole host of these kinds of issues. But surrogacy is a scenario whereby one person contributes the genetic material and one person contributes the womb, so-called gestation. What are the halachic ramifications? Does one fulfill the mitzvah of puravu? Who's the halachic mother of this child with respect to kibud av v'aim? We joked over Shabbos. It's gotten so complicated. You need to know who to send the card to on Mother's Day. Genetic mother or the gestational mother. And we remarked that Hallmark paskins that both mothers are considered the halachic mother. And things have become so complicated that you might read the following in the personals. I was reform as an embryo, conservative as a fetus, and orthodox from birth, seeking same. There are issues of inheritance, there are issues of financial support, etc., etc. All these questions are being dealt with. There is not an absolute consensus on this. There are those who claim that it's the genetic mother. There are those who claim it's the gestational mother. One major halachic nafkamina. Important difference is if one of the partners in the process is not Jewish. Most poskim today would probably, out of doubt, if any one of the partners was not Jewish, would require a conversion for that child. Misafek. What are the ramifications of that conversion is a big question. Because let's say it's a girl that's born and she wants to marry a Kohen, and 25 years later, would she be able to marry a Kohen because she had a conversion, but it wasn't a primary conversion; it was a conversion of suffix. So those are the things that that poskim need to answer. But it is true that not everyone is comfortable with the concept of surrogacy. And it is true that there are those in the right-wing world who are a little reticent to employ surrogacy. So did Shtisel get this correct? They did indeed get this correct. It was the posek was a little hesitant to paskin that way. The husband was a little hesitant to do it. But they agreed, and there are those clearly many who agreed to do this. But I hasten to add those who do this, and Baruch Hashem, many in the Jewish community avail themselves of a lot of these technologies. They need to be done with rabbinic consultation because there are so many complex areas that that are involved in almost every step of the way. So they are 3 for 3. So we're doing good. So we're coming to our final one, that is issue number 4, which is Ruchami risks her life to have a child. Is her decision ill-conceived? Now think about that. It's actually a triple entendre. So think carefully. Think carefully about that.
Question, when her husband was against surrogacy, that put a lot of pressure on her to go ahead and have a baby on without telling her husband or without telling the rabbi. So in a way, the husband was the cause of her decision. And
Are you saying it's always the husband's fault? Is that what you're trying to say?
if he put undue pressure.
No, right. There's no question that that's a factor. That's a psychological factor. So is that a mitigating factor in her act? So an interesting application of that would be sort of a theoretical application. So there are those who argue that when someone does something that's halachically inappropriate, we can't necessarily exercise halachic loopholes to save them from what they've done to themselves. So how would this apply here? So she, on her own volition, decided to put herself at risk. Maybe we can't come to her rescue and save her from her own possible death because she's the one who put herself in this problem. So your answer would be a reason why we would not act that way. But let me put that in another context, or it may be a little more easily understandable. You have someone who is a heavy drinker, who is on the transplant list, or a heavy smoker who needs a lung, heavy drinker needs a liver. So do we say that since that person is responsible for the disease, they are the ones that cause this disease, do we say they are not entitled to an organ because they are responsible for bringing this upon themselves? So it's a dangerous path to walk, because there are many things that we are doing to ourselves that we are responsible for. But suffice it to say that that's the issue. But let's just a few comments on this, and we'll conclude to see if indeed Shtisel was 4 for 4 or not. So in terms of general, a woman risking in pregnancy in general. So let's take just a step back, not talk about this crazy scenario where she's putting her life at risk by becoming pregnant. What about regular pregnancy? So a woman is not mechuyev in puravu. A woman is not obligated in puravu. Why is a woman not obligated in puravu? So one possible reason is because you can't obligate someone to put themselves at the risk of pregnancy. Even a routine pregnancy is risky. Now, what about this question? And this is a question that has been asked and discussed. What if you have a case of a woman who is normal, has a normal pregnancy, healthy pregnancy, and the doctors tell her she needs a cesarean section? And she says, I refuse to have a cesarean section. I didn't sign up for a cesarean section. I signed up for normal delivery. Is she within her rights to sacrifice the fetus by saying, I don't want to have a cesarean section? The doctors say there's no way this fetus is going to survive without a cesarean section. So believe it or not, there are some poskim who say she does not have an obligation to have a cesarean section. Now, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach argued that perhaps, I don't know if he actually poskin this way practically, but he said she's right. She didn't sign up for this. And it's a higher risk. And she doesn't have to engage in that higher risk. Others, like Rav Elyashiv, Zatzal, and Rosh Hashanah, they argued that no, it's not true. It's just it's clearly a higher risk than natural pregnancy, but it's still within the realm of acceptable risk, and people today are doing it. Now, as far as the woman refusing, and does she have right of refusal, and does that factor into the discussion? There are very sad scenarios of women who are pregnant and then are diagnosed with malignancies, with cancers, very difficult, challenging situations. And they cannot get the therapy they need until the fetus is delivered or an abortion takes place. And the doctors will not give her chemotherapy until an abortion has been accomplished. So in all these cases, almost across the board, the poskim will say, you have to abort. your life takes precedence over the fetus. But what if the woman says, I don't care? And the scenarios are going to change depending on what the prognosis is with the chemotherapy and without the chemotherapy. But there are circumstances where the rabbis will tell the woman, listen, we can make a suggestion. We can tell you that we think it's halachically appropriate. At the end of the day, the decision rests with the woman. And if it's important to her, if her legacy of having a child to survive her outweighs the possibility of her living, it wouldn't outweigh possibility of complete cure, but it could possibly outweigh the possibility of living an extra period of time. So the posting will give a woman the ability to make that kind of decision. Is that the case here? So that's not really the case here, because if she had the abortion, she could be treated and continue to live and it not be problematic. She could get the therapy that she needs and not have to worry about it. So there are poskim, few as they may be, who might allow in the following scenario. And there's a sefer called Toras HaUbar. Toras HaUbar is an entire sefer, and it is literally this thick of halachas that deal with the fetus, every aspect of fetus, from abortion to these exact scenarios and all variations and permutations. And they actually mention a shita, albeit an outlier, that states that if there is a couple that genuinely, honestly believes and has true, utter, complete faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ultimate faith in God, that if they put their faith in the hands of God, that God will help them and will cure them. So in that very unique scenario, which I know wouldn't apply to me for sure, but I can't speak about all the people in this room, that in that scenario, assuming there is at least a theoretical chance that she could survive and the baby could survive, they would matir that couple, that woman, to refuse the abortion and to let nature take its course and put themselves completely in the trust of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So based on this das yachid, based on this one opinion, one position, shall we say that the Shtisel got this one right as well? So I will argue, I think we should go for a sweep here, ladies and gentlemen. I think we should go for a 4 out of 4. And I think Shtisel did very good. I'll happy to take questions in just a second. But in conclusion, what happened to Ruchami? Does anybody know what happened to Ruchami?
Yeah,
So,
leaving Orthodoxy.
so here's the picture. I didn't want to include it because it would spoil. But this is the picture of her with her baby. She survived, and the baby Baruch Hashem survived.
He ended up having a cesarean.
So she didn't. Yeah, to be honest, I don't remember if there was a cesarean. yeah.
And hopefully she was treated.
Are all these situations the medical reality? No, every pregnancy would be difficult. Every pregnancy would be difficult.
She had a child, she had children.
Or you're saying, would it make the subsequent pregnancies easier if she had one pregnancy?
No. Yeah. It's the same question, but now she has 2 or 3 kids or whatever.
Oh, I see. Interesting. So she already, for example, fulfilled the mitzvah of Puravu, or already had a child.
Yeah.
So the answer is, it indeed might factor in. It indeed might factor in terms of allowing her to refuse. And by the way, that is a factor in terms of permitting assisted reproduction if a family already has children. So there are families that have 7, 8, 9 children that still want to have children and are going to a Rav to ask a Shiloh if they can use assisted reproduction. So Rav might say, you've already fulfilled the mitzvah Puravu. That also might affect a tshuva about contraception. So if a couple already has fulfilled the mitzvah of Puravu, contraception is much easier to permit from a halachic perspective than a family who has no children, for example. So the answer is yes, it definitely would factor in depending on the circumstances.
I also
Yes.
wonder, like at the time of Rambam, pregnancy was a much riskier situation than it is today. So when Rambam paskin, it was a totally different world for women. Many of them died in childbirth. And how did they even perform an abortion? It must have been extremely risky back then.
That is certainly the case. That is certainly the case. And postpartum death was very high till very recently. Postpartum death was high. Death of the child shortly after birth was also very high. Neonatal care was very poor. The question that you really have to ask, which is not always easily answerable, is not, and this, by the way, applies to all medical halacha and other halacha as well, is not, necessarily what the Rambam paskined in his time. Of course, you want to know that, you want to understand what his thought process was. But the question you have to ask, or at least theorize, which you won't always be able to answer accurately, is if the Rambam were alive today, what the Rambam would paskin. Given the reality of today, so given the treatability of pulmonary artery hypertension, even with the treatability, I'm not sure if they'd allowed her to become pregnant. It still would be complicated. But what would the Rambam say, if the Rambam were alive today? Yes.
So doesn't the Rambam actually say that until the baby actually appears, the head appears in this world, that's when the baby becomes a nefesh, right? So I don't know that the Rambam doesn't have to go to the point of rodef beforehand if the baby is right.
That's part of the question. Why he even invokes rodef in the earlier stage,
Although
doesn't invoke it after.
But there's also a difference between who's actually preventing the death of the mother, right? We're not talking about an auto abortion, right? The Rambam is talking about somebody else being able to step in and do something to save the mother's life, right? In the circumstance in the Rambam. So if you have two lives, then all of a sudden becomes you can't choose one over the other.
Exactly.
Okay.
That is.
But when the baby is in utero, right? It's you can look at it. I mean, the Rambam doesn't say like a rodef; he says rodef. But
no, he does. He actually says kirodef.
Kirodef, right? Exactly. Yeah. It's not an actual rodef because it's not an actual nefesh at that point.
Right.
So perhaps the mother
you are actually stating one of the interpretations of the Rambam.
Right.
That the third party observer, once the baby comes out, even if the baby's a rodef,
right,
you have reciprocal redifa,
right,
and you can't make, as a third party, you can't make a decision. But in utero, there's an asymmetric redifa, because even though the fetus has some status of nefesh, it's not a full status of nefesh. And just parenthetically, let me just add, one of the most famous cases, landmark cases in the world of medical halacha, was the case of Siamese twins, which Josh has written some wonderful articles on. And that case of Siamese twins was a case of conjoined twins in the late 70s in Philadelphia that shared one 6-chambered heart. And if left untouched, they would most certainly die within a few months. The only possibility was to sacrifice one to save the other. And the twins, to make a long story short, there was asymmetry between the twins physiologically. And when Rav Moshe Feinstein, we talk about Rav Moshe Feinstein and the Rambam and Rodef with respect to abortion. So Rav Moshe Feinstein invoked this very Rambam of Rodef, rendering a decision about whether it would be permissible to separate these conjoined twins. And his psak was, because of the asymmetry between them, that in a standard case of rodef, if they both had claim on that heart, there's no way you could choose. You'd have to, 2 deaths is better than 1 murder. That would have been the decision. But when there's an asymmetry, and that one is considered parasitic and one is considered sort of the primary, so then he invoked this case of the Rambam and allowed the surgeons to perform the procedure. C. Everett Koop did the separation. Yes.
If you take a look at the Rambam, does the Yehuda have the option of saying,
does the
Yehuda have the option of saying,
right? Those are good questions. I mean, I don't know all the ins and outs of the sugya of rodef. By the way, the question also, can the mother take the life of the fetus? Now, obviously, she's probably not going to want to do that, but to save her own life. So a third party is a different story, but she is the nirdaf. So she could potentially sacrifice life fetus even after the fetus is born. She could protect herself and in self-defense. Yes.
Question. With regard to whole issue in surrogacy, it was done with Rav's agreement, recommendation, whatever it is. What obligation or what are the halachos involved with the rabbi having to advise surrogacy? Adoption. I mean, obviously, adoption is not, it's a different kind of
Right. No,
relationship, but
great
why
question.
wouldn't that- I mean,
So adoption is a fantastic thing. Adoption is an absolutely wonderful thing. There are some people who prefer to have their own genetic child if possible.
so
Now, even in cases of surrogacy and all forms of assisted reproduction, sometimes the reproductive tissue comes from both the husband and the wife. Sometimes it comes from only the wife. Sometimes it comes from only the husband. And some people would prefer for at least one of the partners to have a genetic contribution. It's not a simple answer to that question. There are many variations and permutations, and that's something that not only needs discussion with the rabbi, that needs discussion amongst the family members and as to what exactly would be the best for each couple.
so the rabbi would have to take into account her medical condition in that conversation as well.
Uh,
Weighing those two options, yeah.
I mean, possibly, depending on the circumstance. Yeah, there are many factors that would go into the decision. Yes.
Two things. Number one, I guess the question of the Nirda saying opting out, I guess one problem, the Gemara talks about the idea of Osama or Damayafa. So if you see someone who's being pursued, you don't even see us, but you still are obligated to act in that case. So I would guess that in this case, the doctor would still have an obligation to try to save the mother, even, under whatever the circumstances are. Right? So that would still factor in. Number two, the other thing is as far as the Rambam being very specific about when it starts to get into the category of a default. I noticed that you didn't really deal with any of the issues of dildo uber hemo or not, and whether or not that's a question of toleration, whether or not that's Netilas Neshama, whether or not.
Right, that's beyond the.
But according to, and the reason I even bring it up is because it would seem that the Rambam doesn't necessarily disagree with the idea like the Ramban says, that it's just it's not a sentient being at that point. It has no ethics at that point, the fetus. So therefore, it might be that it wouldn't count as a life. It's only at the time of possibly being born that it attains that status of a nefesh that you have to deal with. But he wouldn't necessarily disagree with any type of abortion beforehand. That would be halakhically permissible.
We need to have a chavrusa after this discussion. But I just want to pick up some point. There's so many layers of discussion here, and there's so many ways this could go. And there is also a shas-wide machlokas about whether uber yerech imo or lav yerech imo. So for those of you not familiar with the term, uber yerech imo, by the way, has nothing to do with the taxi company. Uber yerech imo is a debate whether a fetus has an independent life status or a fetus is part and parcel of the mother, meaning it is a limb. It's simply an organ of the mother, just like the mother's kidney, the mother's arm, the mother's liver. The fetus is another limb. So that very much relates to the definition of maternity, by the way. If some say that a child can't have a halachic mother, so a woman can't be a mother over her own kidney, over her own liver, there has to be a separation of the child from the mother. If you hold, by the way, that uber yerachimo, that in fact the uber is the fetus is a limb, so there has to be complete separation from the mother in order for you to define the mother as a halachic mother, for her to have the status of maternity. She can't be a mother of her own organ. She can only be the mother of a separate, independent child. As opposed to fatherhood, the only possibility for fatherhood is the donation of reproductive seed. But there's fascinating issues which we didn't discuss over Shabbos, but they're complex issues relating to the current situation in Israel now about posthumous paternity, which is a whole nother fascinating discussion, which you might actually discuss in the next session. The next session, when is that session? Maybe I'll count December 8th in the near future. So I'll leave that for the next session.
Yes. One more thing I want to say, the last part of it, and that is you mentioned the idea about whether she can refuse. For instance, in a case like if someone, like a woman who's fasting for Yom Kippur, and the question is she refuses to eat, I believe the halacha is that you forcibly feed her, so we don't be in that situation because we're worried about the threat. So why would that not be the same case over here?
Yeah, it may be. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm not a posek, so I wouldn't answer that in a definitive way. But I can definitely conceive of a position that it would be permitted to force, especially in a pekuach nefesh circumstance. I mean, we in the world of medicine, so I practice emergency medicine. I have many patients throughout the years that refuse treatment, life-saving treatments, Just literally save their life with relative ease. Antibiotics, dialysis, pretty straightforward, and refuse. And I know they're going to die if they refuse the therapy. I can't force them to do any of these things. My hands are tied. And by the way, it's halachically permissible to be shevel tasa, to be passive and allow that to happen, and so I can preserve my license and ability to continue to practice medicine. But from a halachic perspective, there are scenarios where it's maybe permissible to coerce people to undergo therapy, no question about it. Rabbi Yaakov Emden said you can force someone to undergo an amputation that would save their life. So the concept of coercion is definitely halachically acceptable. Yes.
Mentioned, in the context of abortion, a third party observer seeing a mother's life at risk versus a mother perceiving or having true awareness of her life at risk. So would halacha look differently upon a mother taking an oral medication that would cause abortion versus a procedural abortion?
Great question. So the concept of a woman taking an oral medicine for abortion is actually discussed in the Gemara itself. I can't believe I don't remember, but one of the I think it was I want to say Ruchami, might have been Ruchami, but there's one of the Amoraim, I believe, is an Amora. His wife came to him. It's a classic Gemara in the discussions of contraception. So I apologize if I'm misquoting. And disguised herself and said, would it be okay for me? I don't want to have any more children. Would it be okay for me to take a kos shel ikrin? Kos shel ikrin is an oral solution and an oral medication, some form of potion, some form of liquid, which would induce a medical or either induce sterility, basically. So he said yes. He said yes. And then later, she undisguised herself. And he said, I wish, had I known it was you, he didn't say I would have changed my decision, because I would have wanted to have, more children. Again, I don't remember the exact scenario, but the point is, it is halachically permissible. And that is the halachic basis for the permissibility of the current contraceptive pill. Contraceptive pill is most analogous to the kos shel ikrin, which according to most rabbinic authorities is halachically permissible for a woman to take.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I'm actually personally happy because I read somewhere that I think Shtisel's coming back with another season at some point. And now I know I can comfortably watch it because they're halachically. Is that right? Okay. Anyway, thank you very much. I don't know if you can stay for a few minutes if people have individual questions, but thank you so much. It's been like an incredible day for me, at least hearing you just these two times, and the community appreciates you and continue your great work. And thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you everybody for joining us on Zoom.